And Mr. Taylor and Matthew are about to start another really fun lesson. Today's focus will be on Harry Truman, President Truman, and domestic issues. So I'll take you through all that stuff, focusing on politics, the economy, and society. And I'm sure that's just bringing you to the edge of your seat, and you're anxiously awaiting all of that really interesting information. One other quick note on the quizzes: I'm almost done. Just know that it sends back a bunch of feedback to you, and I'm generally commenting if you have questions or concerns. So look at it. If I ask you a question, feel free to shoot something back to me. But yeah, definitely take a look at the quizzes so that you know how you're doing on that, at least World War II content. And as for your Matthew moment, here he is. Oh, he's going to get front and center.
I'm gonna teach you another fact, and it's about Abraham Lincoln again. So Abraham Lincoln got shot at a show. That's it.
Thank you, Matthew. Very interesting. You building a Lego right now?
Yeah.
Okay, have fun. Okay.
Shoot, Charlie.
Charlie's taking a nap over there. He lives a tough life. Here's our interesting stuff. So again, we're in the heart of the Cold War, as you guys recall from yesterday. Remember, Truman's muscles brought nasty China across Korea. We're not focusing so much of the Cold War today. I want to zero in on what's happening in the United States, but this is definitely Cold War related. So just understand that as a result of our escalating tensions with the Soviet Union, we begin to rearm as if we're at war again. So we're not technically at war, but we're going to be spending as if we're in a continual warlike economy. So just understand these Cold War tensions will lead to our military spending going through the roof, and they'll be comparable to World War II, and eventually will surpass what we're spending during World War II. And I'll show you a couple charts of that in a second. Just a few tedious details here. We kind of revamp our Department of Defense, and we create the CIA. That's a notable thing because we'll be more and more involved internationally, and the Central Intelligence Agency will embed itself in foreign countries to really promote democracy and capitalism. And you'll see how they get involved in some somewhat controversial things by the 1950s. Here's the other thing to focus on. This is a bill passed by Congress, NSC 68. And what it means is a whole lot of defense spending is coming. Let's look at that. In terms of defense spending, first let's glance at this chart, and you see the World War II years, we're clearly spending a lot of money on defense. Right after the war ends, all that money drops, but once NSC 68 is passed, we start spending and spending and spending and spending more and more, and you'll see that this will continue to go up through the 60s, and by the 1980s, we're spending way more than we were during World War II. Now, what percentage of our expenses go to the military? This one's kind of telling. By 1962, almost half of our budget, half of all of our spending goes to the military. Are you wondering how that compares to modern day? I've got a chart for you. 2020 proposed budget. So just kind of look at this one. Again, 49% of all of our proposed spending is going to go to the military. Here was the proposed one in 2020, where of all our discretionary spending, 57% would go for defense. And again, I've mentioned this several times that we spend a lot on defense in our country, and you can clearly see that. This one's interesting because it compares us to the rest of the world. All those other countries, I don't know if you can see this one down here, but that's China. And again, we spend more than most of the world combined. So kind of interesting, but I would argue that it all starts with this, post World War II warlike economy, starts with a Cold War. We spend a lot on the military, and we still do to this very day. So interesting continuity there. You want to have a DCUSH moment? This could be your best DCUSH moment yet, because remember those APers? Yeah, they still have to take the AP test. So they've got to go back and remember like labor history before the Civil War and the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era and be able to pinpoint labor detail with each and every decade that's been taught. Well, we need to look again at labor history, but have your DCUSH moment and, take a nice deep breath and a sigh of relief that you don't have to remember all of this stuff on an AP test this year, especially with our difficult learning situation right now. So let's zero in on 1940s, 1950s labor, and let me simply say that labor did well in the 1930s. If you guys recall the New Deal had all sorts of help for labor. So they're doing well, doing well, doing well. Everyone's at work in the 1940s, but I've kind of introduced this as a roller coaster ride throughout American history. In the 1950s, labor is going to go downhill. And it's going to be a continued, free fall downhill up to modern day for organized labor. This is the beginning of the end for organized labor. And again, when I'm saying this, I mean like labor unions, workers in factories. This Taft-Hartley Act crushes them. It takes away all of the rights that they had gained in the 1930s. So I think that's as detailed as we need to get. It takes away the rights they gained in the 1930s. It reverses, all of that New Deal legislation that really gave power to labor unions. So Harry Truman vetoed this thing when Congress passed it. Congress then overrode the veto. So labor, they feel like they're getting stabbed in the back. Fight the slave labor law. There they are, stabbing the worker in the back. And it really was bad for labor. And again, that's the storyline from the 1950s up to modern day. Organized labor, labor unions have had less and less power with each passing decade. So to wrap it up, how's labor doing in the 1950s? Not so great, as you can see here. And this Taft-Hartley Act is going to start that free fall on their, kind of roller coaster ride downhill through the rest of the 20th century to modern day. As for Harry Truman and his big plan, let's note something about the fair deal. Remember, Harry Truman takes over after FDR. FDR had the New Deal. Truman wanted to continue the New Deal, but make it bigger. So this was the plan where he wants to continue and expand Social Security. He wants the government to invest in public housing. He wants the former soldiers to have all sorts of government help. And he's also going to get involved in civil rights here. More on that in a second. But let's just kind of understand this with our perspective. FDR has the New Deal, clearly big government with a New Deal. The fair deal is the design to make it even bigger. Here's the thing, it's not going to work all that well, with the exception of helping veterans. The veterans get the GI Bill, they still have it today. If you are a veteran, you can get these low-cost business loans. You can start your own business. Or some of you might have veterans as a parent. They could get free college education or even pass that on to you. So that would apply here. This GI Bill was passed. Everyone wants to support the returning troops. And there were millions and millions of returning troops coming back from World War II. So this thing passes. Again, you can go to school. You can get a low-cost business loan. And that's actually what my grandfather took advantage of. He came back from World War II, got a low-cost business loan, and started a carpet company. So he would sell carpet for the rest of his life. So anyway, a lot of people did that, and it would expand the middle class. It would absorb the returning GIs. And if you think about all those millions of guys coming back, this helps them out a ton. So we could argue this GI Bill was one highlight of the fair deal. The rest of the fair deal, not going to do all that well, as you'll see. Truman's going to be up for re-election. And keep in mind, he took over through the death of FDR. So he's now running on his own in 1948. He actually was not too popular. So he's going into 1948. He's mad at Congress for gutting all of his plans. His popularity, well, let's just say that he's no FDR, and he's got Congress kind of up against him. In addition, he split the party. So when he's nominated in 1948, the Southern Democrats break away. Now ask yourself, what could cause the South, the Southern Democrats, to break away from the Democratic Party? What could Harry Truman do to make the Southern Democrats mad? Bingo. He's progressive when it comes to civil rights. So Truman issued an executive order calling for the integration of the military. He bans segregation in the armed forces. He officially integrates the military for the first time here, and the South rejects it. So the South actually goes on the extreme here, and they break from the Democratic Party, and get this, they form their own party. They call it the States' Rights Party, and they have this guy, Strom Thurmond, as their nominee, who actually carries these four green-looking states here. Strom Thurmond, by the way, served in Congress like almost until the 2000s or so. He lived until he was 101 years old. Strom Thurmond later officially left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party when the Democrats went totally on board with civil rights in the 1960s. So this is a constant that you really need to understand if you want to understand the flip-flopping of political parties. When the Democrats go pro-civil rights, the Southern Democrats will leave the party. So in 1948, they break away, they form their own party, the States' Rights Party, also called the Dixiecrats, and they nominate this guy who stays around for a very, very, very long time. More on Strom Thurmond when I get to the 1960s. So just understand that Truman, progressive civil rights, splits the party. What chances do you have to win if you split the party? You're probably thinking he doesn't have a chance at all, right? That's what the newspapers thought. So the newspapers, they're like, oh yeah, Truman, he's not going to have a chance at all at winning. So they pre-printed all of the headlines. Dewey defeats Truman. Dewey defeats Truman. Yeah, Truman actually won. So Truman, it was a bit of a surprise. The people ended up supporting him, and he was able to eke out this victory by defeating the Republican Dewey and actually winning, even though he split the party. So now that Truman wins, he wants the fair deal to be the big thing. He wants the fair deal to be pushed forward. He wants Congress to like expand the New Deal. Yeah, not much of it works. Again, you do have the help for the veterans, but not much else is going to be passed, as I'll show you in a second here. But the fair deal, link that with Harry Truman. Here's it as a giant egg. Nobody's going to hatch it. Not much is going to happen as a result of the fair deal. These are a few of the things that do pass. Ooh, he increases the minimum wage. Rent controls. He actually tweaks our immigration policy. So we do allow 400,000 refugees to come in. You get an increase in Social Security. So I would look at this slide. Don't try to stress memorizing any of this at all. Just understand he's got a few small victories with a fair deal. But all of his big plans, the big expansion of the New Deal, fails. He wants money for education. They say no. He wants more help for farmers. No. He wants to help labor. No. He wants a national health plan. No. He wants civil rights. No. So most of the fair deal fails. And a lot of these things that he proposes, the opposing party calls it socialist. You'll see that Harry Truman has a really interesting quote about socialism. So I put that on the closing question today. Just note that this expansion of the government to help out those in need was dubbed socialist by his opponents. So just kind of check that, think about that, look at his quote that I put on the closing questions, and I think it'll help you understand some things. As for the economy, while the economy is doing well, don't try to memorize this, but just kind of note simply that our economy is booming in the 50s and 60s, and then we kind of sidestep it in the 70s a bit. But look, our national income, the money people make, it doubles in the 50s and doubles again in the 1960s. That would be like my salary doubling in a decade and then doubling again. Yeah, that hasn't happened. But think about the national income doubling and doubling again. People are doing well. Americans were 6% of the population, but we are 40% of the wealth in the world. Yes, we're becoming the wealthiest country in the 1950s. The middle class, we're getting an emerging middle class, 60%, double that prior to the Depression. And we buy and buy and buy all sorts of things, not just one car, two cars. You get a TV, you get this, you get that. That's the thing in the 1950s. In fact, there's a saying, you got to keep up with the Joneses. Whatever your neighbors buy, you want a new one. So we're just buying and buying and buying, and that is fueling our economic growth in the 1950s. Was there a similar decade? Are you thinking? Hopefully you remember the 1920s was similar to this in terms of our consumption, spending, and economic boom. So hopefully you understand a little bit of that. What's causing it? You got a number of kind of complicated factors, but during World War II, you couldn't buy anything. Things were rationed. So there was, the desire to spend. There was some government spending as well on kind of the military that gave people jobs. There was help for the returning veterans. So you get a number of things causing the economic boom in the 1950s. Here's where people end up moving to. They move out of the city into the cookie cutter suburbs. So just kind of think this is a new trend. It's where, a lot of us, most of us live today, where every house is very, very similar right next to the other one. It's a new thing that starts in the 1950s. More people have automobiles, highways are going to be constructed, and you can move out of the inner city into the suburb. And there's one important name to note with the first kind of two guys that construct this, mass suburban housing area. Let's make something of note for the Levitt brothers and Levittown. They plowed over a potato field, and they did this mass housing project where they were able to do low-cost housing for the emerging middle class. But here's the thing, it's not open to all. In fact, in all of these suburbs, you end up getting white people. In fact, it's called white flight, as whites will leave the inner city, and the inner city you're going to see will decline through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, to be continued on that topic. But let's note Levittown, and then just kind of note who's living there. We're getting kind of more segregated in suburbia, you could say. New role for women. Remember women in World War II flexing their muscles, Rosie the Riveter, the huge contributions during the war. Oh, now it's back into the home. So now the men are going to kind of retake those factory jobs, and the old traditional Republican motherhood cult of domesticity role is glorified yet again. You'll see this reinforced in books, magazines, movies, TV shows, where their traditional role as a homemaker and mother is kind of the norm. What do women think about that? Many will embrace it, but here's the thing, not all will. Some kind of loved the new freedom and opportunity, the jobs, the power of World War II, and you're actually going to see some rebellion emerge with women in the 1950s, and that will fast forward to an all-out feminist revolution by the 1960s. So just kind of note that yes, many do conform to this, but not all will, and you're going to see some rebellion from these traditions in the 1950s and later the 1960s. Here's the baby boom. There again is the traditional role of women, where you have kids, you raise the kids, and everyone is doing it. So in terms of the baby boom, I think you've heard that term, like boomer. Isn't that something that you guys say now? Okay, boomer. Well, that's what you're referring to, all the kids that were born right after World War II, really going into the early 1960s. And it is a population boom. Basically, all the men come home, the women go back home, and you have one kid, two kid, more kids. So we've never really seen that huge, population boom in a generation since. In fact, we've had a declining birth rate up to modern day, but here the average is, 2, 3, 4 kids per family. So those are the boomers, as it's called, the post-World War II baby boom. And looking at some of this, hopefully you can figure out the details here. Politically, Again, it's Harry Truman. Harry Truman's got some problems as president. He's able to win, but he can't get through his landmark legislation, his fair deal, really with the exception of that GI Bill. So we do help the veterans, but he's not going to be able to get too much other than that pushed through Congress. As for the economy, it's booming. As for society, women back in the home, African Americans, you do have the gain with the integration of the military, but the rest of civil rights, everything's still segregated, and there will be some major obstacles anytime African Americans want to, push forward with more progress. Middle class whites, they move to suburbia, and again, veterans, they get the GI Bill for significant help. Short, sweet, to the point today. I want to cover the Korean War and the explosion of some atomic bombs tomorrow. So check out the closing questions. I may add just a short video clip to reinforce a few of these things, but hopefully you got it. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and have a good afternoon.